The rain had been falling since sundown, the kind of steady Oregon drizzle that soaked through your coat no matter how fast you moved. It was past 2 in the morning, and the only light in my parents' house came from the yellow lamp on the side table in the living room. I stood in the center of that room with my father glaring at me from across the coffee table. His shoulders were tense, the veins in his hands raised and trembling as they gripped a stack of legal papers. My mother was just beyond him near the kitchen doorway, arms folded across her chest, watching like she had all the time in the world. He pushed the papers toward me again. "Sign it, Lena." His voice was low but rigid, the way a frozen river creaks before it cracks. I shook my head, my stomach coiling tighter. "I am not giving you my savings, Dad. That money is mine." The words tasted of fear and defiance. He stepped closer, the smell of whiskey rising off him, mixing with the musty scent of the old carpet. "You think you got here without me, without us. Everything you have is because of this family." My mother's eyes didn't move from me. Her lips pressed together in a faint curve that looked almost like amusement. I kept my gaze on him. "I worked for that money." "It is not going into your business." His jaw tightened. "You will sign it tonight." He took another step, and the lamplight caught the deep lines in his face, the shadow under his brow. I could hear the rain against the windows, each drop sharp in the silence between us. My heart pounded in my ears. He closed the last bit of distance, his voice dropping lower. "If you think you can walk out of here without helping your own family, you are mistaken." I opened my mouth to respond, but the sudden movement of his hand cut off the words. His fingers closed around my hair, and before I could pull back the side of my head, hit the wall with a sickening thud. White sparks exploded behind my eyes. My ears filled with a rushing sound, like I was underwater. Pain bloomed from my temple down my jaw. The lamp wobbled on the table beside me, its light swaying over the room. I slid down the wall, my knees folding beneath me. My vision swam. Through the haze, I saw my mother step forward. For a second, I thought she might push him back, tell him to stop. But she didn't. She stood close enough for me to see the lines at the corners of her eyes, and then she smiled. It was small, tight, the smile of someone who believed they had just won. My breath caught in my throat. The room felt suddenly colder, the air heavier. My father stepped back, tossing the papers onto the coffee table, like a dealer throwing down a losing hand. I put my hand against the wall, forcing my legs to move. My shoulders screamed in protest, my head throbbing with each heartbeat. The carpet felt rough under my palm as I began to crawl toward the hallway. The sound of the rain was louder now, or maybe it was just that the rest of the house was so silent. Behind me, my father muttered something. I couldn't catch his voice, already fading into the background like a bad radio signal. My mother stayed where she was, watching her arms still folded. I kept my eyes on the dark strip of hallway ahead, focusing on the front door beyond it. My hair stuck to my cheek, wet with a mixture of rain from earlier, and fresh blood trickling from the cut above my brow. The hall seemed to stretch longer than it ever had, each movement sending a wave of pain down my neck and into my spine. I reached the front door, my hand fumbling for the latch. My fingers felt thick and clumsy. When the lock clicked, the sound was sharp in the quiet. I pulled the door open, and the damp air rushed in, carrying the smell of wet leaves and asphalt. My bare feet hit the cold porch boards, and the chill shot up my legs. I stepped into the night, my knees buckling halfway down the steps. I caught myself on the railing, gasping for air. The rain dotted my skin, mingling with the warm trail of blood down my temple. Behind me, the door closed with a soft thump. No footsteps followed. No voice called my name. The only sound was the rain and my own ragged breathing. I started down the driveway on my hands and knees, not trusting my legs to hold me. The gravel bit into my palms, each scrape a reminder that I was still moving, still alive. My vision blurred again, streetlights smearing into halos. I kept going, each crawl carrying me farther from the yellow light of the living room, from the wall that still held the echo of my father slamming my head against it, from the smile that had frozen my mother's face in my mind forever. When I reached the edge of the street, I stopped and sat back on my heels, the world spinning around me. My breath came in short bursts. Somewhere inside, a small voice told me I had crossed an invisible line, the kind you don't go back over. I had left more than the house behind. I had left the last illusion that my parents would ever protect me. The rain kept falling steady and cold as I turned away from the house and forced myself to stand. My legs trembled, but I took the first step into the dark street away from the people who had just shown me what I truly meant to them. The walk away from the house felt endless, each step a reminder of what I was leaving behind and what I stood to lose. My parents had always been my only nearby family. In this small Oregon town, the Morgan name carried weight, not all of it good, but enough to keep people from asking too many questions. If I severed ties with them, I knew exactly what would happen. They would shut me out completely, pretend I didn't exist, and anyone in their circle would follow suit. I had no siblings to lean on, no cousins close enough to call just a few friends who still lived hours away. On paper, I had stability. I worked as a freelance graphic designer, managed to build a modest but reliable list of clients, and had saved enough to feel like I was finally building a life that was mine. In reality, that life was fragile. That savings was my safety net, my chance to one day buy a home, start a small design studio, maybe even take a real vacation. My father knew that. My mother knew that. It was why they wanted it. Their business had been bleeding money for years, the construction market in town shrinking while their debts piled up. They had already taken out loans, mortgaged the house, sold off equipment. Now they wanted me to cover their last bad gamble, and if I refused, they'd make sure I paid in other ways. In this town, your reputation was currency, and my parents could bankrupt mine in a week. It wasn't just the money at stake. If I signed, I'd lose the independence I had scraped together since college, the little control over my own choices I had fought to reclaim after a lifetime of being told where to be, how to act, and what was acceptable. If I refused, I risked becoming an outcast, not just in their eyes, but in the eyes of the people who had known me since I was born. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had moved out years ago to escape the suffocating control of my family, only to find myself pulled back into their grasp because of one bad night, one request dressed up as a duty. My mother's smile earlier still burned in my mind. It wasn't surprise or even satisfaction. It was certainty. She believed I would fold, that I was too afraid to stand alone, too bound by the idea of family, to walk away. And for most of my life, she'd been right. I had been the daughter who came home for every holiday, who took their side in arguments with neighbors, who defended them, even when I knew they were wrong. That night was the first time I had seen what that loyalty was worth to them. They had taken my compliance for granted for so long that they didn't even bother hiding their contempt when I hesitated. If I gave them what they wanted now, it would never stop. There would always be another crisis, another emergency that only my resources could fix, another moment when my worth to them was measured by what I could hand over. I thought of the years ahead, each one more hollow than the last, until there was nothing left that belonged to me. That was the real price, not just the money in the bank, but my voice, my choices, my freedom. Standing in the rain that night, with my head throbbing and my knees weak, I understood something I'd been avoiding for years. Walking away would hurt. Staying would destroy me. Long before that night, the foundation for everything that happened had been laid brick by brick in my childhood. My father, Frank Morgan, was the kind of man who believed control was the same as love. He decided what was best for everyone in the household and made sure we knew it. My earliest memories of him were not of hugs or bedtime stories, but of instructions, rules, and corrections. When I was 8, I remember standing in the kitchen holding a schoolbook fair flyer pointing to a set of illustrated novels I wanted. He glanced at the price and shook his head before I could finish speaking. "Books from the library are free, Lena. You don't need those." That was how he measured value. If it wasn't necessary for survival or for the image of the family, it was wasteful. My mother, Marianne, was quieter, but no less complicit. She played the role of the soft voice, the calm explanation after my father's outbursts. She would come into my room after one of his lectures and sit on the edge of my bed, smoothing the blanket, while she told me he only wanted the best for me, that I shouldn't take his temper personally. It took me years to realize she wasn't protecting me. She was smoothing the path so I would fall back in line without resistance. By the time I was a teenager, I knew better than to ask for things my friends took for granted. No after-school jobs unless they were for the family business. No weekend trips unless both parents approved the exact schedule. When I was 17, I received a scholarship to an art program in California. It was a full ride, the kind of opportunity that could change a life. I came home from school the day I got the letter, breathless with excitement, and handed it to my mother. She read it, smiled faintly, then set it on the counter without a word. That night at dinner, my father told me I wasn't going. He said, "You're not moving halfway across the country. We're not sending you out there to get lost. You can study here live at home. We'll save money." His tone made it clear it wasn't a discussion. My mother kept eating eyes on her plate. I told myself they were just being protective, that they didn't understand how important it was to me. But deep down, I understood exactly what was happening. They were keeping me close where they could still control every choice I made. Even when I finally left for college in Portland a year later, it was because I chose a school they approved of, one they could drive to in 2 hours. They still called every other day asking what I was doing, who I was with, whether I was keeping up with my classes. At first, I thought it was just parental concern, but there was always an undercurrent of judgment. If I didn't answer, my phone would light up with messages from my mother, escalating from polite reminders to sharp warnings that my father was getting upset. When I started freelancing after graduation, my father called it a hobby. He asked when I was going to get a real job with benefits, something stable. He didn't see the hours I put in, the clients I worked to secure, the slow growth that was finally paying off. He just saw that I was making choices without him. My mother's role in all of this was to make me believe I had some agency, to pretend I was making my own decisions, while subtly guiding me back into their framework. She'd say things like, "You know, your father just worries, and isn't it nice to have family to fall back on?" It was easy to believe her when I was younger, because the alternative, that both of them were invested in keeping me dependent, was too painful to face. Looking back now, I can see the pattern clearly. Every time I took a step toward independence, they found a way to remind me that I owed them, that my life was possible because of their sacrifices. They kept a mental ledger of everything they'd ever done for me, ready to pull it out when they wanted something. That ledger was the weapon they'd been sharpening my whole life. By the time the night in the living room happened, I was already carrying the weight of years of subtle manipulation and outright control. I had been trained to believe that my needs came second to the family's, that saying no was selfish, that loyalty meant obedience. And that was the deepest root of all the belief that no matter what they did to me, I was still supposed to stand by them. The week before that night, my parents invited me over for what they called a family dinner. It wasn't unusual, though the timing was odd. They never asked me over on a Thursday. When I arrived, the table was already set with my mother's best china, the kind she only brought out for holidays. The roast chicken in the center of the table gave off a smell that would have made my stomach growl if not for the knot of unease tightening in my chest. My father was at the head of the table, a stack of papers at his elbow, pretending to read a newspaper. My mother moved around the kitchen, her voice overly warm as she told me to sit. I knew before I took my seat that this wasn't about catching up. We made it halfway through dinner before my father pushed the papers toward me. "It's just a small favor, Lena." He kept his tone casual, but his eyes were sharp. I looked down and saw it wasn't small at all. It was a transfer agreement, my savings into their business account. My mother chimed in quickly, saying it was only temporary, that they'd pay me back once things turned around. I set the papers aside. "I'm not comfortable with this." My father's jaw twitched. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "You know we've supported you your whole life. You wouldn't even have that money without us." My mother's voice softened, the practiced note of a peacemaker. "Your father's been under so much stress. This would really help him sleep at night." I shook my head, trying to keep my voice steady. "That's my safety net. I can't risk it." My father's hand came down hard on the table, rattling the silverware. "Don't talk to me about risk. You're acting like a stranger." My mother dabbed at her mouth with a napkin, her eyes glistening as if my refusal was a personal attack. After dessert, I stood to leave. My father followed me to the door, his voice low enough so only I could hear. "You keep this up and you'll regret it." I didn't answer. I got in my car and drove home, my hands tight on the wheel, replaying every word in my head. I thought maybe it would end there, that they'd find another way to patch the hole they'd dug. But over the next few days, the calls started. My father's voice messages grew sharper, each one reminding me of everything they'd ever done for me. My mother texted daily, alternating between guilt and sweetness. By the fifth day, I stopped answering altogether. I thought that would buy me peace, but instead it built the tension higher. That Thursday dinner had been an ambush disguised as a meal, and deep down I knew they weren't done. They never were. 3 nights after that dinner, I drove back to my parents' house to pick up a box of my old sketchbooks I had left in my childhood bedroom. It was late, and I thought they might already be asleep. The house was dark except for a thin strip of light under the living room door. I stepped inside quietly, telling myself I would grab the box and be gone in minutes. As I reached the stairs, my father's voice cut through the silence. Going somewhere. He stepped out of the living room, blocking the hallway, the same stack of papers in his hand. We are not done talking. I told him there was nothing left to say. I'm not signing. He moved closer, his shadow stretching across the wall. You think you're too good for this family now? Too good to help the people who raised you. I kept my voice as even as I could. I'm not risking my future to fix your mistakes. For a moment, I thought he might just yell that I could walk past him. Then his expression hardened in a way I had never seen before. He stepped forward, closing the space between us, and grabbed a fistful of my hair. The pain was immediate, sharp at my scalp. Before I could twist away, he yanked me toward the wall. My temple hit the drywall with a sound that seemed to echo inside my skull. The world tilted. My ears roared like I was standing beside a waterfall. I tried to push back, but his hand shoved my shoulder, pinning me in place. My vision blurred, colors bleeding into one another. Then I heard another set of footsteps. My mother appeared at the end of the hall, her sweater draped neatly over her shoulders. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes sweeping over me, slumped against the wall. For a moment I thought she might reach for me, tell him to stop. Instead, she tilted her head and smiled. The expression was small and precise, as if she'd been waiting to use it. Now you understand, she said, her voice almost a whisper. Now you know who decides what happens here. Her words slid under my skin, colder than the pain throbbing in my head. My father let go abruptly, and I staggered forward, my knees buckling. The papers fluttered to the floor beside me. I dropped to my hands and knees, trying to steady my breathing. The hallway stretched out in front of me like a tunnel. I started crawling toward the back door, every movement sending a jolt through my shoulder. Behind me, their voices faded into a low murmur, as if I were no longer worth the effort. My palm slid through something warm, and it took me a second to realize it was my own blood trailing down my face and dripping onto the hardwood. I reached the kitchen and pulled myself upright against the counter, my fingers slipping on the edge. My mother's perfume still lingered in the air, sweet and cloying. I pushed through it, stumbling toward the back door. The cold night air hit me like a wave when I stepped outside. My bare feet pressed into the wet grass, and I made it halfway across the yard before my legs gave out again. I landed hard on my side, the damp seeping into my clothes. Somewhere inside the house, the door closed with a quiet finality. They weren't coming after me. They didn't need to. They'd already made their point. Lying there in the dark, the pain in my head pounding with every heartbeat, I realized I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. There was no going back to pretending this family was anything but a cage. I forced myself onto my knees, then my feet, and started toward the street. Each step was unsteady, but the distance between me and that house grew, and with it something else took root, small, faint, but impossible to ignore, resolve. I made it as far as the edge of the street before the world tilted again, and I dropped to my knees. The wet asphalt soaked through my jeans, the smell of rain and oil heavy in the air. I must have looked like some lost shadow in the dark, because the next thing I heard was the creak of a gate and the hurried steps of someone crossing the street. Lena. The voice was high and shaky, belonging to Ruth Walker, my parents' next-door neighbor. She was in her mid-60s, silver hair tucked under a hood, her gardening gloves still on like she had been outside tending to her yard even in the drizzle. She crouched down beside me, her eyes going wide as she took in the blood at my temple, and the way I was holding my shoulder. Oh, dear God, what happened to you? Her hands hovered over me like she wanted to help, but wasn't sure where to touch without making it worse. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words tangled in my throat. Ruth didn't wait for an answer. She was already pulling a phone from her pocket, her voice turning brisk as she called 911. Yes, I need an ambulance. My neighbor is hurt. Head injury, possible shoulder damage. She's bleeding. She gave the dispatcher our location and then tried to shield me from the rain with her coat. You're going to be all right. Just stay with me, she said, her voice softer now. Within minutes, the street was alive with the wail of sirens, the red and blue lights splashing across the wet pavement. 2 EMTs jumped out of the ambulance, their boots splashing in shallow puddles as they knelt beside me. One of them, a man with kind eyes, started asking questions, while his partner began checking my vitals. Can you tell me your name? He asked. Lena Morgan, I managed. What happened, Lena? I hesitated, glancing toward my parents' darkened house. The shape of it loomed at the end of the street, silent and still. My father's shadow was nowhere to be seen. My mother's smile flashed in my mind, colder than the rain. I fell, I said, the lie automatic ingrained. The EMT didn't push. He simply nodded, shining a light into my eyes to check my pupils. We're going to take you in, all right, just to be safe. As they lifted me onto the stretcher, Ruth gripped my hand. I'll come see you tomorrow. Don't you worry. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights were almost blinding after the darkness outside. The doctor who examined me was a tall woman with a calm, steady presence. She pressed gently around my temple, asked me to move my shoulder, and winced when I tried. Dislocated, she murmured. She looked at the nurse. Let's get her some pain relief. Then she turned back to me. Lena, I need to be honest with you. These injuries, her eyes flicked from my head to my shoulder, these aren't consistent with just a fall. They look like they came from a significant impact. My throat tightened. I didn't answer. She held my gaze for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then finally nodded. All right, we'll treat you and make sure you're stable. But if there's anything you need to tell someone, you tell me or the police. Even doctors froze. That was the phrase that echoed in my mind as they worked on me. Not from shock at the injury itself, but from the knowledge of what it likely meant. They couldn't force me to speak, and I wasn't ready. Not yet. They discharged me the next afternoon with my arm in a sling, a prescription for pain medication, and a stack of aftercare instructions. I didn't go back to my apartment right away. Instead, Ruth insisted I stay with her for a few days. Her house smelled faintly of lavender and old books, a welcome change from the damp, cold air of my parents' place. She set me up in her guest room, a small but warm space, with a quilted bedspread and a window that looked out onto her garden. The first night I barely slept, my mind replaying the sound of my father's voice, the flash of my mother's smile, the thud of my head against the wall. By morning, Ruth had made coffee and a plate of toast, and as I sat at her kitchen table trying to focus on eating, she said she wanted me to meet someone. That afternoon, a woman in her late 50s arrived at the door. She was tall with sharp eyes and a firm handshake. Ruth introduced her as Karen Holt, an old friend and a lawyer who had handled more than a few domestic abuse cases in her career. Karen didn't waste time with pleasantries. Ruth tells me you had a rough night, she said, her gaze scanning the bruise along my temple and the awkward way I was holding my shoulder. I'm not here to push you into anything you're not ready for, but I am going to tell you this. You need to start documenting everything. She pulled a small notebook from her bag and set it on the table in front of me. Write down what happened in as much detail as you can remember. Take photos of your injuries. Save any messages or voicemails. Even if you don't think you'll use them, keep them. My instinct was to argue, to say it wasn't worth making things worse, but the quiet confidence in her voice made me pause. I agreed, and that night, in the stillness of Ruth's guest room, I began writing. At first, my hands trembled, the words halting and messy. I wrote about the dinner, the papers, the argument, the moment my father's hand gripped my hair, the sound of my head hitting the wall, the way my mother looked at me. The more I wrote, the clearer the images became, and the more I realized how many moments I had already tried to push away. The next day, Karen came back with a small camera and showed me how to angle it to capture the swelling on my temple, the purple bloom of the bruise spreading across my shoulder. We went through my phone, saving every text from my parents, even the ones that seemed harmless. "You'll thank yourself later," she said. The act of gathering those pieces, of turning my pain into something tangible, felt strange at first, almost like I was betraying them. But with each page I filled and each photo I saved, the feeling shifted. I wasn't just a daughter they could control. I was a witness to what they had done. And witnesses could speak. A week later, Karen sent a formal letter to my parents. It was short and to the point, informing them that any further contact with me had to go through her office, and that harassment threats or attempts to access my finances would result in legal action. She printed it on thick cream paper, with her firm's letterhead, the kind of document that carried weight before you even read it. She sent copies to both my parents and their business address. The response was swift. My father called less than an hour after the letter would have been delivered. I didn't answer, but his voicemail was waiting when I checked my phone. His voice was tight with anger, each word clipped. "You think you can hide behind some lawyer? You think a piece of paper changes the fact that you're my daughter? You don't know what you're starting." There was a long pause, then a low growl of words that made my stomach clench. "If you want a war, Lena, you'll get one." I saved the message and forwarded it to Karen. "Good," she said when she listened to it. "He just handed us evidence of intimidation." Meanwhile, the small-town rumor mill was starting to turn. Ruth told me she had overheard two women at the grocery store whispering about how Frank Morgan's business was in worse shape than anyone realized. Another neighbor mentioned that my father had lost a major supply contract after a client heard about the fight at the house, though no one knew the full story. My mother kept silent publicly, but I could feel her fingerprints in the way some people in town started looking at me, curious, pitying, cautious. They didn't know everything, but they knew enough to question the Morgan family's perfect image. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one under their roof feeling small. They were the ones cornered, their control slipping. And it was only the beginning. 2 weeks after I left my parents' house, I decided to host a small dinner at my apartment. It was the first time in months that I wanted people in my space, the first time I felt ready to let voices and laughter fill the rooms again. Ruth arrived first carrying a basket of bread still warm from her oven. Karen came next holding a bottle of wine and a folder she refused to let out of her sight. Behind them were two of my design clients who had become friends over the years, bringing dishes they had made themselves. My apartment wasn't big, but I had pushed the table against the wall and brought in every chair I owned. We crowded around the mismatched plates and thrift store glasses, making the table look like a patchwork of my life. The conversation flowed easily about everything from Ruth's stubborn roses to Karen's latest case to the ridiculous demands of one of my clients. At some point, I realized I was smiling without thinking about it, my body loose instead of braced for impact. Midway through the meal, Ruth raised her glass. "To Lena," she said, for knowing her worth. Everyone clinked glasses, and the sound was light and warm in the air. I swallowed the lump in my throat and said, "Family isn't blood, it's who shows up when you bleed." No one said anything for a moment, but I saw Karen's expression soften, and one of my friends reached across the table to squeeze my hand. I had spent years thinking my value was measured by how much I could give, how much I could sacrifice to keep the peace. That night, surrounded by people who wanted nothing from me but my company, I felt the truth settle in my chest. I wasn't the sum of my parents' expectations or the weight of their disapproval. I was mine, and I wasn't alone anymore. A month later, I stood in the doorway of my new apartment, the winter air pressing against the windows, carrying the faint scent of rain from the streets below. I was holding a letter in my hand, the envelope already torn open. The handwriting on the front was my mother's, neat and deliberate. Inside was a note that began with, "Lena, we need to put this behind us for the sake of family." The rest was the same old rhythm I had known my whole life, a mix of soft words and sharp edges, reminders of everything they had done for me, hints that my future would be lonelier without them. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what they had done, only a demand wrapped in concern. I stood at the counter, the paper trembling slightly between my fingers, then tore it clean down the middle. The halves fell into the recycling bin without ceremony. Some doors stay closed for a reason. That night, my chosen family arrived for another dinner. The smell of roasted vegetables and fresh bread filled the air. the table covered in mismatched dishes, and the low hum of easy conversation. I thought about the night I had pounded on my parents' door bleeding and desperate begging to be let in, and how they had left me outside in the dark. Now, I was the one deciding who walked through my door, and every face at my table had proven they belonged there. After everyone had eaten and settled into the living room, I stepped out onto the small balcony. The city lights shimmered in the damp air, and the laughter from inside drifted out to join the sounds of traffic far below. I used to think strength meant never breaking, holding yourself together no matter what. But real strength was what grew in the cracks, the kind that came from piecing yourself back together on your own terms. I looked back through the open door at the people who had shown up for me when it mattered most. I didn't need the Morgan name to feel whole. I didn't need their approval to define who I was. I closed the balcony door gently, sealing the cold outside, and walked back into the warmth. The cycle ended here.